let's see. I just want to make sure I'm recording in the right place. Otherwise, it takes me longer than necessary to push out the link for people that aren't joining us. But anyway, so welcome. I am grateful to have the three of you with me tonight. And at any time, stop me if you have questions. So I really kind of want to see this as more of a kind of open dialogue. I do have some slides I want to go through, but more importantly, spend time with, if you have questions about your project, if you have questions about, things coming up and so forth. So before I get started though, I do want to just ask, does anybody have any pressing topics or questions, right out of the gate that they feel like they need to just throw on the wall? Just yes, spew out there before I get going. And it's going to be answered in the PowerPoint, but I always like to offer people the opportunity to get started. Annie, it looks like you're anxious to...
Looking for some clarification. So Mickey and I have chosen to work together on this project just because I wanted to have that opportunity. I like that you gave us the opportunity to work with someone. So, it's been great working with her. But we are a little bit unclear about the abstract. I feel like even though I've looked up, APA abstracts and stuff, and I've done something similar before, I just want to make sure that we're reaching what you are looking for specifically, and like maybe just some bullet point guidelines. I'm sure you'll probably go over it, but that's just something that I really want to talk about tonight.
Okay. Yeah. And it's, I realize that it might be the first time for some people who have even really heard that word or even had to really think about, what that is. So, it's good to sort of get your feet wet in this class, because as you move forward throughout the program, you'll be doing a little more of this area, but also when you get into your research courses, of course, which is not that far away for you to be taking the Intro to Ed Research 6525. So, hi, Karen. Looks like we just welcome.
Hello.
So I do have it on the slide, but I think it's going to be good to have Annie to go back to your question to kind of. Let's talk a little bit about what do you understand it to be? What are the questions you have of it, and what should you be looking for as you create? And one of the things I want to for sure remind people is, an abstract is a very brief, tight synopsis, right? You're not writing me a paper. I mean, it's a paragraph. If you write for an academic journal, for example, oftentimes they'll say you're a 200-word abstract.
Okay.
Okay, so it's short. That's what I don't want people to stress out and think, oh my gosh, I've got to write this, elaborate, plan. It's very, very, very short, and it's really just what is the essence of your project. What is the essence of what it is you're turning in? So I'll get to that. We'll talk a little bit more of it in detail. I'll make sure I get to it. It is in the slides, and I want to make sure people have time at the end for questions as well. And I know you said you may have to jump out early for your school board meeting, Annie, so I want to make sure as well. But Karen, just to give you just a little bit of rewind here, I just asked if people had questions, like right away before I went and got started. And so Annie had a question just briefly about the abstract. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and talk a little bit about which you're all experts on. And I'm making sort of that assumption on competent teaching, right? So you're all high quality teachers, and I believe that with all of my heart and soul. But I also believe with all of my heart and soul, myself included, because I am an educator, is that teaching is a profession that continually evolves, number one, and number two, we can continue to get better at. Okay? So when Darlene Hammond uses the terminology competent teaching, I think there can be sort of two schools of thought with that. One is that she's being critical of teachers in general, which I don't think she is. I think her position on it was to really define and detail what are some skills, right, that can be defined, that are research based, that can be defined as what do we mean by competent teaching, right? So she lists in her text, and I'm not going to read these. I just want to share the slide, give you just a minute to kind of look at them, because my sense is you're all doing something on this list or a version of something on this list. Okay, you may not be in the throngs of it now, but there's a theme in Darlene Hammond's research. And I'm going to ask somebody just to sort of take a stab if you've kind of what you think in terms of what exactly is she kind of getting at, if you will. If you look at this slide, what do you sort of, what jumps out at you, if anything? Just a general question. Anybody?
The focus on authentic, kind of meaningful, the meaningful nature of these things, authentic instruction, authentic assessment, not kind of meaningless, not empty assessment.
Okay. That's right. There's no wrong answer.
Right. I look at the continuous opportunities to learn.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Our Benedictine value in action, our love of learning. Okay. Yeah. Anybody else see anything that kind of jumps out?
I think that professional learning communities piece, okay, especially for me right now, being with the SIG grant through the state of Minnesota, that's a huge part of our week. But it also is very beneficial to sit and meet with our teams. Mm-hmm. And then on those, you know, when we get to correlate and do the vertical PLCs and we get to visit with other grade levels to see what's working, what we need to do more of, or those kind of things, it's very helpful.
Okay. Anybody else have anything? Or one of the things that strikes me is the continual push on, and not in a negative way, but to be thinking about assessment in multiple ways, right? So, you know, data-informed decisions is really taking data from some form of assessment, right? So varied assessment, authentic assessment, those types of things, and continuous, and I would argue that good professional learning communities continually finding opportunities to learn are driven by some form of data, right? Mm-hmm. So how do we define or determine our professional development? Somebody somewhere along the line has identified a need or a gap or an area of interest. Doesn't always have to be a gap per se. So I think the idea behind competent teaching is to take, you know, some of these big ideas and throw them into some very manageable buckets. You know, how are we thinking about assessment? And when we talk about data-informed decisions, are we talking about, you know, best practices in teaching and learning, evidence-based practice? And that is sort of an umbrella, I would argue, theme, along with the ideas of equity and social justice in Darlene Hammond's book, is that we're continually rooting ourselves in the cycle of not just continuous improvement, but in the cycle of making data-informed decisions, and that we're using evidence-based best practices. We're not grabbing on, and this we're guilty of this probably more than any profession, I think, as educators, and not us as individuals, but the profession is we grab onto things that we think that oftentimes are a moving target or a floating fad, if you will. Okay. Our profession, oftentimes, pretty soon we're learning this new strategy, or it's all about grit, or it's all about, you know, problem-based, or it's all about, right? Nothing wrong with us learning about new ideas and new strategies, but at the end of the day, what are the roots of good teaching? I like to competent's an okay word, and that's fine. But I really like to think about, competent teaching practices for learning, right? So that we're always, at the end of the day, that the bullseye and the target is always about student learning. And there is not necessarily one perfect, as you all know, strategy, right?
Right.
Because kids are so varied and diverse. So when we talk about varied assessment tools, as Darlene Hammond points out, we can't forget the importance of varied instructional strategies, right? So the two kind of go hand in hand. And I think she really gets at that in a lot of her work. So I just wanted to sort of touch on her broad umbrella of this competent teaching. And we're kind of right. I'm looking down because I've got notes in front of me. I have our syllabus in front of me. So I'm sort of sometimes I think it's better if I just turn my video off, because I often fear I make people car sick because I talk with my hands, but you'll also see me looking down, being in the throngs, if you will, of, competent teaching, and looking at models that are a result of sort of reform, if you will. So some of those models that the KIPP Academy is one model, and I'm curious, did anyone have prior knowledge about KIPP before?
No.
Okay. And just curiosity, quick initial thoughts?
I felt like it was a sales job.
Okay.
Because I sit and take notes on everything. So I'm sitting there writing down, well, there's 5 of these and 7 of those.
Okay.
And then you have 2 of these, but the subgroups are 4. And it felt like I was being sold something.
Okay.
And so I think that it was probably an awesome program, but I kind of got stopped at that.
Okay.
It kind of put me off.
Yeah, fair enough. Someone else? Anybody? Just curious, because that is a kind of it really went through a high, the KIPP model, when it first started, and then it kind of trickled and leveled, and it's still going. They have schools. I think there's a KIPP school in Minnesota, if it hasn't closed. I know there was a few years ago, but the whole idea about reform, and how Darlene Hammond really talks about that again throughout her text, that organizing for reform really again falls in these 3 buckets: teaching, leadership, and then the environments that reform is taking place in. So we often think about reform, at the ground level, like in our classroom per se, and I think Annie's, she stepped away, but the idea of her school board meeting, right? A lot of things happen at the policy level, right? We as teachers, are driving a car, but somebody else is designing the road, right? For a lack of a better metaphor, in a lot of ways. Okay, we own the car and we're driving the car, but we're not always in charge of where that car is going to go. Right? And so policy informs practice on every level, but policy has a big, rooting in this whole idea of reform and organizing for reform. So I didn't want to leave that out so we forget about that, right? Because Darlene Hammond does spend a lot of time, it was back in week 9 and 10, I believe, looking at the case studies. So North Carolina, Connecticut, looking at reform that had some real traction, and then reform that just collapsed. And I love her chapter, and I don't have it in front of me, but does money make a difference? Because in the US, we really, really push for more funding, right? And there's a lot of research to support what more funding would do. if you look at what's going on in Oklahoma, are you following what's going on? I hope you're on their Twitter feed and supporting public teachers and, all that, but it's astounding that we have in what's considered to be the richest country in the whole world, kids, having materials that are held together by duct tape, right? And just, and so when we talk about reform, right, from a theoretical level, we can pretty much identify what the tenets of quality reform should be. We have evidence to support what it would look like. But when we get down to the real nitty-gritty of actually passing school reform, it's like a can of paint thrown on the wall. It's all over the place. And that's in the U.S. I'm speaking specifically about the U.S. because when you think about what you learned about the Finnish education model, Pasi Sahlberg, I don't know if any of you saw him at Education Minnesota. He was there a few years ago as the keynote speaker. He was a guest lecturer at Harvard Graduate School of Education. But he'll be the first one to say that Finland puts into practice the U.S. research. We're the best researchers in the world, but we're one of the worst at actually putting it into practice. And so there are countries that take our best practices and they put them into practice. So it's complicated, I guess, is what it's not an easy fix. But it's important as part of the, we're all a link in the chain, right? We're all part of this profession of awesome profession of teaching and learning. I can't imagine doing anything different. But it's important to understand how we sit in such a broader context. Okay. So partly Darlene Hammond's book, and I've been really toying. I haven't had let's see now, I'm trying to think. A majority, and I don't think I've had a student that doesn't like Darlene Hammond's text. They find it eye-opening, a lot of good information. I'm getting a little concerned because it was written, 7 years ago, 8 years ago now, and in education life, that's an eternity. Yep. So I am adding a smaller text in the fall, but I would be curious to hear people's thoughts on, the text, if you feel like the information is dated and that, later on in our last class meeting that I'll be scheduling. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that as well, because I do worry about that. She's got really good information. She's rooted in, research but I do kind of worry about that in that context. So anyway, to go back to reform, that's kind of the idea, that she's really looking at it from teaching leadership and then what are those environments, not just our classroom, but the broader kind of spectrum. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Sometimes I can start going and I get going a little too fast, so I don't want It's easier when there's such a small number. Sometimes, when I've got lots of, double digit numbers, I have to break people up into groups and so forth. So anyway, so a couple questions I want you to think about, and it goes back to the notion of, money, right? So some of the components that we've talked about, and I'm going to scroll back to the competent teaching, because we really do, and to really think about the push in Oklahoma and other areas that teachers are really pushing. Salary is equitable salaries are key, and Darlene Hammond points that out, and in her text. But also what we do with the money matters. More money isn't what matters. It's how we direct those funds that matters. So if we look back, and I'm going to go back a couple slides. Is everybody seeing? Everybody sees the screen okay? Nobody has any trouble? So if we look at just the short list, and this is just a short list right out of her text, you'll see the citation there. Is there anything on here that doesn't need monetary support to happen?
data-informed decisions. You don't need money for that. You don't need money for varied assessment tools. I mean, teacher-created assessment tools.
Okay.
I would argue,
PLCs.
some authentic instruction can occur without monetary, support. But if, like we were just talking about the duct tape together books, like money would help that. That would certainly help the authentic instruction. So.
Mm-hmm.
I
Okay.
think it depends, because data-informed decisions, I mean, as teachers, we're making decisions every day, every second of every day. If it's informal assessments, I get a lot of information from those.
Mm-hmm.
And those don't cost, it doesn't cost anything because you're not going to a training for it, compared to if you're talking about like the literacy assessment. Well, we had to go to a training, which cost the district money, and the books cost money. So I think it depends.
Okay. That's fair. Yep. Any other thoughts?
I use a lot of checklists in my classroom.
Okay.
And so that doesn't require money, just time to do it.
Okay. Time. Yep. The old saying, time is money, right?
Exactly. Exactly.
But I think the point is well taken, that there are some things that we as educators can put into practice in a relatively short time with relatively little to no cost. Okay. There are some broader instructional strategies and components of best practices that are going to require money. Okay. iPads aren't free. Chromebooks aren't free. I'm just using those as examples. I don't know what it costs to be a Google school. I'm not sure, but I don't think that's free. Schoolology, we buy software, right? So
Yep.
those are, so when we think about reform, okay, just, and think about in your own, however short or however long your teaching career is, have those things made a difference in your life? You don't have to answer that out loud, but stop and think about that for a minute. If these things, and I'm just using Schoolology, Google, Chromebook, whatever, iPad, whatever the thing is that has been given to you as an educator, has that made a difference in your life as a professional? And has it made a difference in the life of your students? Has their learning improved? Okay, because those are two fundamental questions that get cloudy to us as educators when we're so deeply seeped in the practice and the day-to-day operations. And that happens. It's a reality, and I watch it with my son's classroom. I have a fifth grader. It's not because the teachers are bad people. It's because we get so deeply, we're so close to something that we oftentimes can't see the forest, right, through the trees. Yep. But think about that question and hang on to it. So have those things really made a difference? Okay, because we do. And the reason why I bring it up, it goes back to this idea about money. Okay, those reform efforts, and I'm going to call those reform efforts because they're reforming your teaching. Right? If you're asked to be using a Chromebook, they're reforming the family's experience with school, if they're on Schoolology or whatever the case may be. Those are reform efforts and decisions that were made by somebody somewhere or a collective, right?
Yep.
Your school board administrator. So again, when we think about reform, okay, this idea of organizing for reform, those just small examples that I asked you about to think about, and I gave you just generic ones, Chromebook, school, whatever it is. Those are teaching impacts. Somebody in a leadership position somewhere made that decision, and it impacted the environments you're living in and your kids, your learners are living in, right?
Yep.
So, as educators, and one of the few professions that really go through as much, we don't have a sort of baseline collective practice, so to speak. Things are different state to state. You know, if you compare us to the medical profession, for example, and the training that goes on, you know, there's a standard pretty much. There's some variability and flexibility, but if you look at, you know, I mean, just case in point, look at what's going on in Oklahoma. That's not happening, you know, necessarily in Minnesota. I mean, it is probably in some districts, but maybe not to that extreme. Or in the Hamptons in New York, right? So if we look around in different affluent, so just to be thinking about those questions about reform and kind of what you know, how have they impacted you as a professional, your learners, and to be thinking about what kind of money went behind those reforms. And I like to try to get you thinking about things because, you know, that don't rely on outside, right? Because, and I'm sure my sister's a kindergarten teacher and I know how much money she spends out of pocket to supplement, right? And I don't think I've met a teacher who hasn't done it in some capacity or in some way or had to provide something, partly because we love what we do, partly because we have a need that's unmet, partly because we want to be creative in some way and we need these supplies, and those are all, you know, really great things. But, you know, those are honorable actions, I would argue, right? I really, really believe that. And so, you know, how do we sort of embrace that part of our profession and keep the sort of, you know, the unification of who we are as professionals, because teachers have strong voices and are in that narrative. And I talked a little bit about this in our first synchronous, about the national narrative around the profession and how so often the profession of teaching can be very belittled to some degree, or can be, you know, really not embraced as professionals, right? Mm-hmm. And so we have to remember that we're a voice in that conversation, in that narrative. Each one of us has a voice in that narrative. And so all of these things that Darlene Hammond talks about, from competent teaching to policy to school reform, touches our lives in some way as educators, but we can't be so overwhelmed that we feel paralyzed to do anything about it, right? And how do we, you know, it's sort of like my mother always told me growing up, pick your battles, right? You know, you know, don't always feel like you gotta, you know, fight everything to the end, but, you know, be selective in how you. And I think that's good advice. And so I think as teachers, we have to think about that too. You know, where do we want our voices to be heard? And I think that's an important part of Darlene Hammond's text. And she doesn't explicitly call it that, but she does talk about in terms of, you know, the power of teachers, if you will, right? Mm-hmm. Any questions or thoughts or comments before I keep going?
I don't think so.
Okay, anybody? So some of the questions that are important for us to ask is, you know, we talk about assessment when we were talking about competent teaching. You know, a couple of the bullet points from Darlene Hammond was really talking about assessment. So how do we assess our teaching? So we assess our students all the time, right? But what are the little things we have in place to assess our own practice? Some people use exit tickets, some people use, you know, a variety of things, but to not lose sight of that important question and the ideas behind, you know, student learning. Well, you know, they passed the test. Well, so they must get it, right? Or they scored above, or they got, you know, whatever. But it's a really, really important question to ask yourself, the evidence that you use to determine whether or not your students are learning. Has anybody read Tom Guskey's book, On the Mark?
No.
Let me see here.
Did you say Gusky?
Yeah, I'm gonna see if I can open up the chat here. I might spell his last name. Oh, wait a minute. We don't want to. Let's see. Whoops. Are you seeing this?
I don't see anything.
Oh, you don't? Okay. It's pulling up a person's. I just wanted to pull up our little chat window, but for some reason, it's not letting me do that. But it's Tom Gusky. So it's Gusky or EY. And then the book is called On the Mark. He was our keynote speaker a couple years ago at our summer conference. And he is an assessment guru. He goes across the nation really working with teachers, educators, and he really, really challenges the ideas of assessment and, you know, what we've learned, what we've become so ingrained in understanding. So it's a really good question to think about, again, going back to Darlene Hammond's point on evidence-based, you know, what evidence are we using that students are learning? Because he really debunks the whole idea of class rank, valedictorian. I mean, he talks about, he's a real standards-based grading guy, okay, to just sort of give it in a nutshell. He thinks the A to F, so well, anyway, even if you don't have an opportunity to read his book, there's a lot out there on him, and to give you some ideas. When you take our assessment course, which I think is next, are you taking that this summer?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. You'll learn about Tom Gusky in there. So it's very interesting, his whole notion on that. But so the idea of really asking ourselves, because I would argue school reform doesn't have to be this big thing like an iPad or Chromebooks or a national movement. School reform can happen right in your very classroom, right? It can happen, and it can start with you as the teacher.
Mm-hmm.
And I think what's that?
Somewhat.
Yeah, and I think that's
depends on your curriculum as well.
Right, and I think that's a very powerful thing. And so how do we still function and live within the confines of our professional role? To your point, Mickey, in terms of what curriculum we're using, what are the expectations, and still be able to unlock our own creativity and our own measures of how do we know students are learning? How am I staying relevant? How am I being engaged in this national narrative of our profession? So there's a lot we don't control, but I'm also a proponent of there's a lot we can control. And I think it requires us to really dig deep into some of those things Darlene Hammond points out in other areas as well, to really think about, so what do I do to stay, if you will, you know, relevant in my practice? Partly what all of you are doing, going to grad school, right? I mean, taking that leap, right, from, you know, bachelor's prepared, you know, teacher, professional to, you know, graduate. That's a big leap. That's huge. So, you know, right there is a relevancy sort of question. All right. So one of the biggest things that sort of is a, I don't know, not a newbie kind of topic, but to be thinking about innovation and what are the components of innovation. And I would even, you know, add the idea around inclusion. So innovation and inclusion. And KIP sort of, you know, talks about their ideas about innovation, the Finnish model, others that have, you know, you'll see charter schools, you see, but innovation doesn't have to be the other, right? I would argue innovation can happen, you know, right in our K-12 public school settings. And it does. And it does happen. And so I list a couple of these, you know, KIP and Finnish and other models, not because those are the leaders, but to counter some of those ideas, to say, wait, there's innovation going on right in my own classroom, right? And I think partly when Darlene Hammond talks about that professional development of teachers, she's sort of getting at that, if you will, getting at, that professional idea of innovation doesn't mean you're going to NASA. Okay, the bar doesn't have to be we're going to the moon. That's a great bar.
Yep.
Innovation can be happening every single day in your classroom, which I think is a really cool thing.
Yeah.
Right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I just wanted to not leave that out, because that's a term that we hear a lot of, kind of nowadays. And innovation and inclusion are really married in a lot of ways, because if we think about innovation, we think about inclusive excellence. We think about really bringing everyone to the table to have opportunity. So who or what has been marginalized, bringing all learners to the table. So they're really, I like to think about them as sort of hand in hand. And partly the reason too that I have KIP up here is because they've really, really zeroed in on serving underserved populations. A lot of their, work sits in, high poverty or marginalized, communities, and they're really sort of committed to that model of outreach. So
Can I just interject 1 second?
Yeah, absolutely.
The TED Talk that you put up for us, George Canada.
Oh yeah, Jeffrey Canada.
Jeffrey Canada. That was so impactful to me. And he didn't give any ideas, some things, but it was so awesome. I really, really, really liked that.
Yeah.
I thought it was wonderful.
Yeah, a lot of people do. They hear him talk, and yeah, he's a pretty dynamic speaker.
Yeah. But I think of that with the innovation, that we have to do some things and fail to get anything better.
Oh, and absolutely.
Yeah, I thought it was really pretty good.
Cool. Well, that's great. That's great. And yeah, it's a great point. The whole idea of innovation and that, MIT, which is one of the, most, elite schools in the nation, right, in the world, you have to fail at something to keep moving forward in their programs, right? You have to fail to keep going. So they have a whole different, and so the importance behind that and their model of education, and they create some of the most brilliant minds in the world, or I shouldn't say create, but they, really embrace and help, cultivate. But part of that is problem solving, that you didn't get the right answer, but you go back and you figure out what you did wrong and you try again. And there's time and room for that to happen. So it's interesting. So, okay, I'm going to get here to the abstract, because I don't want people to get too stressed out. I thought this was sort of funny when I saw this earlier.
Can I turn that in?
yeah, that's sort of what I was feeling. As I thought, I'm wondering if people are getting a little stressed out about an abstract per se. So I found this online, and I thought it was just sort of a cute little image to share and to sort of get a chuckle out of you. But basically, so I don't, and I can do some bullet points if Annie, you think that would be helpful. I don't have bullet points per se written out here in a slide, but the important thing to remember, an abstract is a brief paragraph synopsis of your project, your paper, your research. Okay, it's 200 words or less. It is not a large, you're not explaining the entire project. You're in an essence, here's what it is. You can find sample abstracts online all day long. but it's really just an exercise in getting you kind of started thinking about, what is an abstract. You're experts on a topic that you're turning in, and then it's just, what is the essence of that project that you're working on.
I think my follow-up question is just that, the abstract is due before the project is due. So to me, it kind of makes me feel like I have to be done with the project in order to write the abstract. And we have made progress, but I don't know that we'll be done with the whole thing. And we've done the research, we've read the articles, but I just don't feel like we'd be done enough to like write an abstract. I don't know. That's my concern, is that it's due before the project is due.
Yep. And partly that's done purposefully because you, like you said, you've done the reading. You have not put your presentation together per se, but you know the literature, you know your topic. So, the short synopsis of what, and I'm not going to sit and read it line for line and, compare it to what your, presentation is. It's, really more of, give a snapshot of your topic. What is the essence of?
And I think I'm confused because you say that that's part of our project, correct?
Yeah.
And so you have the rubric here and everything is laid out as far as what the points are, but I'm not seeing where the abstract fits into the rubric.
Yeah, the abstract is like your cover page.
And so there are no points involved.
It's not being graded against any kind of criteria other than you writing a tight synopsis of your project. Yep.
So this is just for practice. Is that what you're telling me?
Well, sort of, but you also should be able to, encapsulate what it is. What is the essence of your project? Yep. So it's a tightly written, really paragraph. 2 paragraphs would be the very most.
Okay.
Yep. And so kind of think about it as like your cover page. It doesn't come with its own point system and its own, assessment system. It's part of going through the research process and completion of a project. Does that make sense?
That's helpful. Yeah.
Yeah, it is.
Okay. Are there other questions?
Will there be in this abstract like citations from the research, or is that getting way more detailed than you want us to be?
Well, that's a great question. So the answer to that is there can be. Okay. So the important part of writing, so you're not submitting a paper for an academic journal. Okay. So I just want to I want you to know that at time, and you might at some point, you might be submitting to, you might do your research project and that's going to get submitted. But sometimes there might be a citation or 2 in an abstract. You might, include, you don't want to write it like it's an academic paper. Okay. The essence of my project on the opportunity gap is that students in poverty have less access to quality education. I'm just throwing that out as a, so you just want to introduce it. What is your top and be done. Don't overthink it. I know that's hard to do and easy for me to say, but don't overthink it in the sense that, it's got to be this it needs to be written, of course, in, graduate level writing and, but it's not a paper.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yep. Any other questions on the abstract or anything else before we close up? Our time goes, or for me, goes by fast. Maybe not. Maybe not for you. I hope that was helpful. I hope, kind of tightened up a little of the content, in terms of Darlingham and some of the things we're covering, talking a little bit about the abstract, use the rubric for the project.
Right.
You know, if your presentation follows that lock and step, you'll do just fine.
Okay.
Okay.
Awesome.
Okay. If you have questions, reach out to me, you know, email me, whatever you need to do. Call me or send me an email, or we can do Zoom again. It really, you know, I'm open. So definitely.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. Good luck at your school board meeting tonight, Annie. And yeah.
We need it. Thank you.
Okay. Well, if there are no other questions, have a great evening and take care.
Thank you.
You too.
Bye-bye.
Okay.
Thank you.
Good night.